Say you've spent at least a couple of hours, sometimes multiple movies, possibly even spanning years of your life, growing attached to certain characters. You would be forgiven for thinking their story would have a proper ending, but there are those times when this doesn't happen. The credits roll before revealing whether they are still alive or not. Here are movie characters whose fates are never resolved. Wanda Maximoff, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. In the MCU alone, the likes of Bucky Barnes, Loki, Vision, Gamora, Thanos, Groot, Red Skull, and everyone who was snapped away in Avengers Infinity War have all died and come back in one form or another. There have though been plenty of deaths that have stuck, and right now it's difficult to see in which of these categories Wanda Maximoff falls. Towards the conclusion of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, Wanda destroyed Mount Wundagore with herself still atop it, something that would have logically seen her fall to her death and be crushed by debris. Agatha All Along on Disney Plus has since confirmed that it is believed in universe that the Scarlet Witch is dead. However, there was a slight flash of red when Wundagore fell, which could suggest that Wanda protected herself. And according to Agatha All Along showrunner Jack Schaefer, Marvel forbid the show from using the word dead in reference to Wanda. Instead, she was said to be gone, maybe. There are almost constant rumors of a solo Scarlet Witch flick in the works at Marvel Studios, but at the moment there is absolutely nothing guaranteed surrounding the fate of the character.
Lee Montgomery, Death Proof. Now, while Death Proof may near universally be accepted to be Quentin Tarantino's worst film, that doesn't mean that it's not a fun slice of B-movie guff that knows exactly what it is. But what it doesn't seem to know is what exactly happens to Lee. Now, the last that we see of this beautiful cheerleader is when she's unwittingly left as collateral with that creep Jasper while her friends take out his 1970 Dodge Challenger for a ride. Now, while Lee's friends mete out bloody revenge against stuntman Mike at the end of the movie, Tarantino never actually bothers to return to Lee. This is especially troubling as Lee's pal Abernathy told Jasper that she was a porn actress, and so the last time that we saw her, she was catching some pretty extremely unsavory looks from the guy. Also, let's remember that Tarantino also cast this actor who plays Jasper as a rapist trucker in Kill Bill, and this type of dual casting has to mean something. And the end result is not going to be a good one.
Rocky Balboa, Creed 3. It's incredibly difficult, damn near impossible, to sprout a spin-off movie franchise as successful as Creed. The first Creed effort is rated higher than any Rocky film on Rotten Tomatoes, and only the original Rocky from 1976 can best the scores of the two Creed sequels. In shifting the focus to Adonis Creed, the franchise offered a fresh new direction for the story, while allowing the return of Rocky Balboa in a new dynamic. As Donnie's trainer, he was still vital to the films, without the narrative retreading any old ground from the previous Rocky stories. However, the Italian stallion was notably absent from the third Creed movie. The series shifted across the states from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, and Sylvester Stallone did not make the trip. The real reason is down to Stallone being unhappy with the direction the franchise was taking. But what about inside the narrative? There is really no explanation given. Did he just not want to leave Philadelphia? Did the two men fall out? Or did he ultimately lose the ongoing battle with serious illness he suffered earlier in the franchise?
Christophe, Die Hard. Die Hard is such an incredibly tight, well-crafted action movie from start to finish, and yet there's one glaring plot strand that's never really tied up. Well, technically two. Once Gruber is dealt with, there are two terrorists who appear to remain alive, the first being hacker Theo, who is of course knocked out in the underground garage by Argyle in the movie's finale, but then there's another villain that everyone always forgets about, and that's Christophe, a French terrorist who assists Theo while he's busy cracking the vault. Moments before Hans is killed, he can be seen running away and then getting knocked out by John. Now this hit clearly wasn't forceful enough to kill Christophe, and yet he's never seen again. Now, of course, it's entirely plausible that he's been taken into custody after this, but amidst the carnage of it all, he probably has a not terrible chance of slipping away undiscovered. After all, canvassing 35 floors is no easy feat, especially with the FBI's finest blown to smithereens, and lest we not forget Dwayne T. Robinson calling the shots. So who knows whether Christophe is the only one of the group that got away scot-free.
Childs and McCready, The Thing. Typically, it doesn't matter what comes before if the ending of a movie can't stick the landing. Who wants to invest in any story only to be let down and disappointed at the end? It taints the entire experience. The Thing, however, simply doesn't have this problem, as John Carpenter's 1982 outing boasts one of the most iconic final scenes in cinematic history. Just Childs and McCready sitting together by the fire with a bottle, waiting. Throughout the movie, the titular shape-shifting alien attacks and kills everybody else in the Arctic Research Station, and due to its nature as being able to completely change its form with no tell whatsoever, there's no way of knowing which host it is using at any one time. This is how the film ends, with Childs and McCready waiting, not knowing if the other has any surprises in store for them. It was uncertain whether either of the men had been replaced by the killer creature or if neither had. Was one of them killed by the other after the screen went black, or were they waiting up until their last breath? And as recently as 2023, John Carpenter has suggested that he is the only one who truly knows.
The English Servant, Kingdom of Heaven. Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven is well, let's just say it's a gorgeous mess of a movie, and absolutely is a film that benefits enormously by watching the effortlessly superior director's cut. But even the 3+ hour extended version doesn't explain the sudden, bizarre disappearance of a notable supporting character, the English sergeant played by Kevin McKidd. The sergeant is a likeable character, but once they set sail for Jerusalem, he's never seen again. Now, some have suggested that he may have been one of the casualties of the shipwreck during the journey, but it isn't indicated by the movie at all. Now, originally it was planned this way, with the behind-the-scenes feature explaining that a dummy was made of McKidd to use for this express purpose, but this isn't ever shown in the theatrical release, and so it's actually just as easy to say that he never went anywhere. It's a shame as well, because he's a character that deserved a proper send-off.
Mace Windu, Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Remember when you thought you'd never see Boba Fett ever again? There's no way Darth Maul could have possibly survived that fall whilst being split literally in two, right? Now Emperor Palpatine was as dead as can be, never to be heard from again, correct? This was all true at one point, but all of those characters returned, though some with immeasurably better stories behind them than others. What this also does is raise questions about other characters seemingly killed off screen in the Star Wars universe. In particular, Mace Windu. In Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, Master Windu was maimed by Anakin Skywalker, zapped by the Emperor, and subsequently fell from a very high window, never to be seen again. Sound familiar? Like with the three characters I just mentioned, though, Windu's body was never shown, and thus there is no proof that he actually perished. Certainly the other side of that particular coin is that there is no evidence that he didn't die, other than the precedent set in the universe by multiple returning thought-to-be-dead characters. With his star power and the popularity of the character, Samuel L. Jackson's Windu seems the ideal subject of a Disney Plus series down the line. Though the last time the actor led his own show on the platform, which was Marvel's Secret Invasion, things didn't go so well.
Knowles, The Thing. John Carpenter's sci-fi horror The Thing is a masterpiece through and through, and honestly, it's one of my favourite films, and say it with me kids, of all time! However, while the film ends with the audience asking who the hell is even human as the Antarctic base burns down around the survivors, it does leave you with another question. What the hell happened to Knowles? He literally just disappears from the movie moments before. After Gary is attacked by a thing-infected Blair, we see Knowles head in the same direction, and that's all she wrote. Now, the movie's home video release did reveal, however, that the original plan was to have him be assimilated, yet due to time and budgetary constraints, the scene was never filmed. But weirdly enough though, in the comic and the novelization, he does get an end, blowing himself up and killing himself respectively. But then that means that there's no consistent answer across the movie, book, and illustration. So what actually happened? Well, maybe he just sat down next to Mac 2 seconds after the film ended and just asked for a swig of petrol. Who knows?
Angelica Teach, Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. After 3 movies together, the trio of Captain Jack Sparrow, Will Turner, and Elizabeth Swann were broken up for the 4th installment in the franchise, Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides. With Orlando Bloom and Keira Knightley abandoning Johnny Depp on the high seas, there was some new blood brought into the franchise in 2011, including Jack's new love interest, Angelica Teach. Teach was also the daughter of Ian McShane's villainous Blackbeard, so villainous in fact that he was happy to condemn his own daughter to death in order to grant himself immortality at the Fountain of Youth. Though Jack foresaw this and gave his rival the old switcheroo, killing him and saving Angelica in the process, she still hated Jack for it. Unable to trust her, Jack marooned Angelica on a deserted island with a single bullet, exactly how he had been left years earlier. In the post-credits sting, Teach found a Jack Sparrow voodoo doll washed ashore, and as she gave an evil smile, she was never seen or heard from again. No mention of her in the next movie, Salazar's Revenge, and no hint as to whether she starved, used the bullet, or managed to flag down a passing ship to safety. Or for that matter, what she did with that Jack doll.
The Puppy, Apocalypse Now. Francis Ford Coppola's war epic Apocalypse Now is a brilliantly thought-provoking film, and one that's left viewers low-key agonising over the ambiguous fate of one of the beloved central characters for over 40 years. Of course, we're talking about the adorable puppy which is informally adopted by the soldiers during their mission, and then it just bafflingly disappears when they're ambushed later in the movie. The cute canine serves as a striking metaphor for innocence throughout the film, so perhaps it's actually quite fitting that the pup vanishes into thin air along with it. Given that the dog disappears when the gang is attacked, it's reasonable to deduce that it was either killed or jumped overboard and paddled to shore, but despite its absence being noted to the audience, it's never followed up on. Then again, Coppola is hardly much of a sentimentalist, so it's hardly surprising that he refused to have the puppy rejoin Captain Willard and his pals at the end. Still though, what happened to the dog?
Lucy Gray Baird, The Hunger Games, A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. With The Hunger Games beginning its story with the 74th year of the titular event, there has been, and still is, much room to expand the cinematic universe. The upcoming Hunger Games Sunrise on the Reaping will detail the 50th games that Haymitch Abernathy won, while The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes covered the 10th ever games, and acted as a backstory for the villainous President Snow. Back in his youth, the future dictator was portrayed as a struggling, less fortunate underdog fighting against the odds to restore glory to his family. However, the snake's true colours were shown by the end of the film. The story was peppered throughout with little details that gave Snow reason to despise District 12 decades before Katniss Everdeen was ever born, the biggest of which was Rachel Zegler's Lucy Gray Baird. She was his first ever tribute as a mentor in the games, and they fell in love, ultimately running away together in the woods of District 12. However, Snow had killed several people throughout this episode of his life, and in something of a wave of paranoia, he realised that Lucy Gray was a loose end who could tell everyone about it. All of a sudden, he decided he didn't trust her and began hunting her through the trees despite being in love with her 10 minutes earlier. Snow found no trace of Lucy, and after he moved back to District 2 to finish his officer training, the movie ended without any closure on exactly what happened to Lucy Gray next.
Paul Holt, Friday the 13th, Part 2. After Jason is seemingly, air quotes, killed in the climax of this supremely dopey but brilliant slasher flick, survivors Ginny and Paul are resting up back in their cabin when, all of a sudden, Jason bursts through the window grabbing Ginny. Except it's all a dream, at which point Ginny awakens to find herself being tended to by medics, and while calling out for Paul, she finds that he's nowhere to be seen. None of the subsequent news reports or glimpses at Jason's makeshift cabin confirm that Paul indeed died, leaving his fate weirdly ambiguous for such a bloodthirsty slasher flick. The film's screenwriter Ron Kurtz did, however, confirm that the original filmed ending more explicitly implied that Paul was dead, with the decapitated head of Jason's mother Pamela smiling creepily rather than being totally motionless as is in the actual ending of the movie, which is all just even more strange.
Alan Quartermaine, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Sean Connery may have had such a bad time shooting the film and may have despised the director with such ferocity that he called time on his legendary career, but looking back, there is a certain charm to The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. No, it's not the best comic book movie ever made, but there is still enjoyment to be found, largely in Connery's role as the grizzled Alan Quartermaine. Brought out of retirement to save his country once again, it was always likely that this was to be Quartermaine's last ride. During the League's war with the mysterious threat that was M, Quartermaine addressed the rumour that he was indestructible. Years before, he saved a witch doctor's village, and so had been blessed and told that Africa would never let him die. After taking a fatal wound during the final battle, however, Quartermaine did die, and was returned to Africa to be buried. The movie ended with a ritual being performed that may have been fulfilling the promise of immortality that had been made to him. The weather turned to storms, and the rocks that buried his body began to quake, but the credits rolled before any confirmation of Quartermaine's survival. Was it all real, or was he undying more in a spiritual sense?
Caesar Flickerman, The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 2. Stanley Tucci's casting as the Hunger Games' Master of Ceremonies, Flickerman, is one of the franchise's several note-perfect decisions, playing the part as he does with a deliciously entertaining mix of high camp and scarcely veiled contempt. And despite being a major character in the franchise, he disappears long before the end of Mockingjay Part 2, with his ultimate fate being left entirely ambiguous. In both the movie and the novel, he makes his last appearance announcing the apparent death of protagonist Katniss. Whether Whether he'd been eaten alive by the newly liberated citizens, arrested, or simply let go is anyone's guess. But in fairness, back in 2011, franchise author Suzanne Collins stated that he did indeed survive the rebellion due in part not being directly affiliated with President Snow. However, given that she was talking about the books and there are many clear differences between them and the movies, it doesn't necessarily mean that his screen counterpart also survived.
John Otway, The Grey. These days, more movies than ever add in one final mid- or post-credit sting to either give the audience one final laugh or tease the future of a film franchise. One film that gave a post-credit scene before the idea took off to new levels in Hollywood was The Grey. In 2011, Liam Neeson's John Otway led a group of stranded plane crash survivors through a frozen waste, fighting off a pack of wolves as they went. Otway had worked with wolves before, and before long the battle boiled down to just the alphas of the two groups. It's a genuinely emotional moment as John prepares to throw himself into a literal fight for his survival, but the screen cuts to black before anyone sees how Otway and the weapons he taped into his hands fared against the wolf. The post-credit scene offers a tiny glimpse into what happened next, as both man and beast lay still after the fight. By no means is this confirmation of John's death. Certainly he could have been dead, but he also could have been unconscious. He could have been drained and physically unable to stand. He may have just been taking a moment to process after the fight.
Peggy Brandt, The Mask. Jim Carrey's The Mask is one of the rubber-faced comics' best movies, and it's aged surprisingly well over the last 25 years. But there's one major character who is conspicuously absent from the third act of the movie, reporter Peggy Brandt. She ends up betraying Stanley to gangster Dorian and is, well, never seen again. It's jarring given the expectation that there be some kind of follow-up to her duplicity, and yet there's nothing. But as it turned out, truer to the harsher tone of the comic on which the movie was based, director Chuck Russell originally filmed a macabre scene in which Peggy is murdered by Dorian. Once she gives Stanley up, she's thrown into a printing press, after which a series of blood-stained newspapers are printed out reporting her demise in a, air quotes, freak accident. Despite how well executed the scene is, Russell felt that it was out of step with the rest of the film and was also toying with the idea of bringing Peggy back for the sequel. So instead, Peggy just vanishes and the rest of the movie continues without her. Weird. While we at least know the original intent, given that the deleted scene was cut for specific storytelling reasons, we can't possibly conclude that it sufficiently explains her absence from the rest of the plot.
Magneto, X-Men Days of Future Past. The original X-Men trilogy was one of those movie franchises that had two outstanding entries but just couldn't stick the landing. In 2014, 8 years after X-Men The Last Stand underwhelmed both critically and commercially, Days of Future Past took the bold step of erasing that timeline completely. So when Logan returned to the present, a lot had changed. The obvious differences came in the form of characters who were there that weren't there before. Neither Jean Grey nor Scott Summers were dead, and Hank McCoy appeared to be teaching at Professor X's school rather than working for the government. Still, this was just the tip of the iceberg for a very different world. What followed Days of Future Past was a glimpse into the new timeline with X-Men Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix. The latter took the story up to 1992 and finished with Charles Xavier and Eric Lensher seemingly friends, just about as far from what they were when the franchise originally began in the year 2000. However, there was no mention of Magneto when Logan returned in Days of Future Past, and thus no clue as to what Eric did with his life after that chess game with his friend at the end of Dark Phoenix.
The four other Basterds, Inglourious Basterds. By the end of Quentin Tarantino's blood-soaked masterpiece Inglourious Basterds, the 11-member team of Nazi-hunting bastards has seemingly been whittled down to just Lieutenant Aldo and Smithson. Except, wait a minute, what happened to the four other bastards who were neither killed nor seen with the pair in the final scene? The four pretty much just disappear from the movie's finale, which, given their potential usefulness in the successful execution of Operation Kino, is just totally bizarre. Tarantino doesn't seem to do anything by accident, but at the same time, it just feels like there's a whole sequence missing where the four men just get taken out of commission, right?
Anton Chigurh, No Country for Old Men. There have been few cinematic antagonists quite as chilling, as intimidating and as unsettling as Javier Bardem's Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. The coldness and the brutality in how he goes about hunting down Llewellyn Moss are almost reminiscent of a machine rather than a man. More like a Terminator than actual flesh and blood. But Anton was human. Behind the iconic haircut, the sick sadistic smile, and the unique pneumatic bolt gun, his bones broke just like anyone else's would when he was involved in a hideous car crash towards the end of the movie. Chigurh paid a nearby kid for his shirt to use as a sling and carried on with his day, but where he went from there was left up to the audience to decide. No Country for Old Men famously ends rather abruptly following a monologue from Tommy Lee Jones' Sheriff Bell, essentially confirming that the story was never actually about Chigurh or Moss. Anything could have happened to the villain afterward, particularly since he was in such a bad way and wanted nothing to do with any hospitals, but the story was about Bell.